Good afternoon, and welcome to this Lunch and Learn hosted by the Edmonton Sexual Exploitation Working Group. We're really thankful to Grant MacEwan University for providing this facility for us. My name is Kate Quinn, and it's my privilege to be the co-chair of the working group. I would like to respectfully recognize that we are meeting on the traditional land of Treaty 6 peoples. This is the ancestral territory of diverse Indigenous peoples whose people have walked this territory for centuries, including Cree, Dene, Saulteaux, Blackfoot, Sioux, and Métis and Inuit people. We are dedicated to working together as diverse communities, as well as all the settlers and from around the world. You'll see here this orange scarf, and there's a little candle here. As the Sexual Exploitation Working Group, we always begin our public events in remembrance of the high cost of sexual exploitation in our community. We remember those who were murdered, those who are still missing, and those who have died as a consequence of trauma, addictions, illness, and suicide. We remember their families and their communities who continue to grieve their loss. Our Edmonton Police Service and RCMP members continue to work on historical and current homicides, and more importantly, to prevent future deaths. As well, we remember all those who are struggling today and the many, many in our community who are working to support youth and adults, from the basic harm reduction to transitions to trauma recovery and to employment programs. The Sexual Exploitation Working Group is a collaborative of community partners, law enforcement, municipal and provincial government agencies, Reach Edmonton, which is our Council for Safe Communities. It's our backbone organization working on crime prevention and community safety. Thanks to Reach Edmonton, this Lunch and Learn is being webcast, and we have people joining in from across Canada. Welcome. The Sexual Exploitation Working Group is concerned for those who are vulnerable to sexual exploitation due to age, financial desperation, migration, homelessness, prior childhood sexual abuse or neglect, mental or physical health conditions, intergenerational trauma, addictions, discrimination due to ethnicity, cultural or racial heritage, sexual orientation, and any other circumstance that contributes to vulnerability. We recognize that there's a continuum of sexual exploitation, from those who trade sex for a place to sleep or something to eat, to those who are maybe more engaged in the commercial sex trade activity, to those who are victims of human trafficking. We use the UN definition of sexual exploitation, which talks about an abuse of power to profit monetarily, socially, or politically from the sexual exploitation of another person. The members of the SUG are Action Coalition on Human Trafficking, Alberta Health Services Addictions and Mental Health, Bent Arrow Traditional Healing Society, Catholic Social Services Youth Follow-Up Program, CEASE, Centre to End All Sexual Exploitation, Child and Family Services of Alberta, the PSECA branch, City of Edmonton Citizen Services, Edmonton Police Services, Human Trafficking and Exploitation Unit, Reach Edmonton Council for Safe Communities, Sexual Assault Centre of Edmonton, and the Family Centre. And members of the working group are all here today to help out. We know that some of you may have questions. There should be cue cards at your tables. If you have a question, please write on it and send it down to this end of the table, not the center end. And then SUG members will pick up the cue cards, and we'll try to see what questions we can manage. Our guest today is Dr. Lauren Martin. Dr. Martin is nationally recognized for her groundbreaking research in the area of sex trading and sex trafficking prevention. She is the Director of Research for the Urban Outreach Research Engagement Center at the University of Minnesota. She's been conducting community-engaged research with community partners since 2006 after receiving her doctoral degree in anthropology and historical studies from the New School for Social Research in New York. She's also a researcher with the university's Children, Youth, and Family Consortium and the Center for Early Education and Development, as well as an instructor at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs. She taught a class yesterday and then packed up and got on the plane and got here about midnight her time last time. But she said she felt confident about some of the great welcome she'd received in Edmonton because she said she thinks some of the similarities between Edmonton and Minneapolis is that we're friendly, we're a little bit more casual, so she wore her snow boots, and also because we always have snow and we've got some things in common. We have a few other things in common in that both of our communities have really mobilized in many ways to address that continuum of sexual exploitation. Both cities have sex trade offender programs, commonly known as John Schools. Both have legislation to support children who are victims of child sexual abuse and sexual exploitation. The Minnesota legislation is called Safe Harbor, and ours is called Protection of Sexually Exploited Children Act. And we have an unfortunate link. In 2013, one of our Alberta MLAs, while on government business, was arrested in a police undercover operation because he tried to contact two women through Backpage.com. He pled guilty, he paid a $500 fine and court costs. Dr. Lauren will share some of the work her community of researchers has done to better understand the demand for sex services that drives the sexual exploitation and human trafficking. She said she's very comfortable with anyone tweeting, so this is our hashtag YegTalkSexploit. Please feel free to tweet, and then we will come back for further conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Can you guys hear me okay with this dual microphone situation? Is it working okay in the back? Okay, great. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me to Edmonton. I'm really looking forward to sharing some of our work in Minnesota, and more importantly, I'm really excited about learning what you all are doing up here. I think sometimes we're in different countries, we're in different contexts, but we can learn a lot from how we're approaching the issues and how we're working. So just a little bit about the place where I work. So I'm at the Urban Research Outreach Engagement Center, which is a place-based University of Minnesota research center located off campus in a community that is typically excluded from university context. So it's a community with high poverty rates, majority people of color, which is not the makeup of the rest of Minneapolis or Minnesota. But it's a community that's really strong in assets and knowledge. So the role of my center is to work with communities in partnership to surface knowledge together. So we're really trying to flip how research is typically done. Before I jump in, I also want to just acknowledge that I'm going to present some findings from a recent study that we did. And I want to acknowledge that this study would not have been possible without the help and support of hundreds of people. So while I'm here presenting, just know that there's a huge team of people who made this possible, and including other researchers, survivors, service providers, police officers, and others across the whole state of Minnesota who really helped us develop the knowledge and findings that I'm going to present today. So just a teeny overview on the project. The role of this project was really to address a major gap in policy, research, and prevention focused on the demand side, right? There's a huge gap in knowledge about who's purchasing sex, where sex buyers live and where they purchase sex. So there's some really basic questions that we don't know. How sex buyers approach the marketplace, and then what the marketplace for sex kind of looks like from their point of view. And then what do sex buyers seek to purchase. So a lot of us have a lot of knowledge around this. So the goal of our study was to really bring multiple people together to try to compile it into more of a complete picture of what's happening in Minnesota. And I think these are really important questions for us to understand the scope and scale of the commercial sex market. While most of our work in Minnesota, and from what I'm gathering here, is really focused on identifying victims and supporting young people, we also need to think about this other side of the marketplace at the same time. So before I jump into the study, I want to do just a little bit of background. Whoop, that didn't work. Ah, there we go. So just to situate the context a little bit, so I'm from Minnesota, so I just wanted to show a map. I know not everybody would know where Minnesota is in the United States. So we actually border on Canada. We're a northern state right on the western side of the Great Lakes. And then I'm based in the Minneapolis-St. Paul region. Just to give you a sense of the size of Minnesota, we have about 5.5 million people, and about half of Minnesota lives in the metro area. So we're actually, population-wise, quite a small state compared to other states in the United States. And let's see. Oh, also from a legal perspective, commercial sex in all of its forms is illegal in Minnesota. So just, I think that context is really important. And I'm not going to go into a whole bunch of definitions because I actually think Kate did a great job of laying out some of the definitions. And Minnesota uses the same basic definitions and how our legislation was laid out and how we view that issue in Minnesota. So I'm not going to cover that same ground. So thank you for that. But I am going to do just a little bit of framing of how our study was set up and how we're approaching the issue. So for the purposes of this study, we're really approaching this as a marketplace. And the marketplace operates on principles of supply and demand, right? So I just want to go over a little bit of terms that I'm going to use. So I'm going to talk about commercial sex because I think, as Kate laid out the continuum, there's a wide range of experiences. And so just a blanket term that I'll use is commercial sex. In Minnesota and in the research that we do, we typically do not use words around prostitution. In my over a decade of work with people involved in sex trading and commercial sex and sexual exploitation and sex trafficking, that framework of prostitution is viewed as stigmatizing and very harmful. So we tend not to use those words. So when I'm talking about commercial sex, that's kind of the overall marketplace. When I'm talking about a sex buyer, we're really talking about people who purchase sex or sexual activity directly from a provider. So there is some gray zones around other types of sexual work or sex work around strip clubs and pornography. This report is really focused on sex buyers, not the other areas. And then the other side, the supply side, has sort of two roles. So we can talk about, I also just want to say this language can be really weird when you start to think about this as a marketplace. It's really kind of icky, and it doesn't feel comfortable as a person who's worked with people involved in sex trading for many years. But our research headed in this direction because it's really important that we understand the logic of what's happening from a market perspective so that we can understand the forces at work. So I use language around marketplace, and I do that because I think if we don't focus on the root of the conditions that are driving the market, we're going to miss a lot of opportunities for prevention and intervention. I just wanted to acknowledge that too. So when we talk about supply, we're talking about people. In our report, we use a composite term, provider and victim, because we want to acknowledge the role. The language gets really confusing around this. So we're talking about people who provide sex or sexual activity, but we know that many people in that role are also victims. And so we use the composite term provider-victim in our research. And then there's a critical role around distribution or trafficking. So we wanted to acknowledge that that's there too. And when it comes to how we define the distribution role, we know that it's about obtaining, recruiting, and distributing victims, often through manipulation and violence. And I'm going to just refer to those individuals as traffickers. I don't know if you all use that term here, but we tend not to use the word pimp because we're trying to frame it again in the legislation around sex trafficking as opposed to the prostitution legislation. Sorry, this is all just by way of background so you know how we're approaching the issue. And I want to reiterate that this marketplace is very complex. There's lots of market segments, lots of different people involved, and lots of different experiences. So really we need to be thinking about multifaceted approaches. Okay. Just want to do a teeny bit of framing on the legal framework, just because might not be familiar with US laws and laws in Minnesota. Essentially there are 4 legal frameworks that regulate commercial sex in Minnesota. So we've got the Federal Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which is really modeled after the Palermo Protocol, and I think it's probably similar to what you have here in Canada. We really look at the action, means, and purpose. So that's how the legislation was set up. So the action is recruiting, transporting, harboring, obtaining, or maintaining a person. The means, according to the federal definition, is force, fraud, or coercion. And then the purpose is for commercial sex, forced labor, or debt bondage. So that's our federal. And the reason I want to just highlight that is because Minnesota has done something very different with our state-based sex trafficking laws. We have fundamentally altered the means portion of that. So in Minnesota, you do not need to prove force, fraud, or coercion. The legislation states the action of recruiting, transporting, harboring, etc., by any means. So that actually makes it much easier for victims because they don't have to go to court and prove the kinds of things that were done to them in terms of force, fraud, and coercion. Because we know that that can be re-traumatizing, it can be very difficult. So it fundamentally changes how prosecutions happen in Minnesota. And then we also have our safe harbor laws, which were passed in 2011. And those laws essentially decriminalize all young people involved in commercial sex. But they increase penalties for sex buyers and traffickers of juveniles. And it's taken that whole issue of young people who are exploited, commercial sexual exploitation, and moved it out of the criminal justice realm into a public health realm. So it's actually administered through the Minnesota Department of Health as opposed to our criminal justice law enforcement systems. So that just radically changes the approach of how Minnesota views the issue. And it also has changed child protection laws. So now all young people who are commercially sexually exploited, it's a mandatory report to child protection. In the past, child protection did not view young people in that situation as in need of protection or support. So that's just some massive shifts that have happened in Minnesota. Sorry for taking a little time. I just want to make sure that you all were familiar with the context of how we're working on this issue in Minnesota. So before I jump into the our work around sex buyers, I just want to acknowledge that the work that we did is really rooted in previous work that UROC and myself did in partnership with Sandy Pierce of a research agency called Oteoni Research. Sandy and I worked together to develop a study called Mapping the Market for Sex with Trafficked Minor Girls in Minneapolis. And just a bit about Sandy, because my partnership with her was really foundational and important for me. Sandy is a sociologist, she's Seneca, and she herself is a survivor. So that partnership is really critical in infusing how we do research. So what Mapping the Market looked at was commercial sex really from the perspective of sex trafficking operations in Minneapolis with juvenile victims. So it was a little bit more narrow. And really what we documented is the use of exploitation, violence, and manipulation to to develop a supply of victims. And this isn't new to anybody. I think what was surprising is that this manipulation and violence is very strategically deployed. It's not just happenstance, right? It's part of how the operations themselves function. Some of the other highlights some of the other findings I wanted to highlight are really with juveniles we see an overrepresentation of young people of color and American Indian young people as victims in Minneapolis. And this little diagram here, the sort of operation, shows how various factors lead to vulnerabilities, and I'm sure you all are looking at the same things here. We also identified sort of processes, so the different ways that sex trafficking operations commit this sort of strategically deployed violence through lover boy pimping, peer recruiting, which is having young people recruit other young people, and then we documented a strategic deployment of rape and sexual assault as part of the foundational underpinnings of how sex trafficking operations work, and also use of multiple perpetrator rape as well as part of the process for how young people are pulled into a sex trafficking operation and then distributed as part of that operation. And finally, we were able to identify sort of 4 ways that sex trafficking operations in Minneapolis, I should say, 4 business models that they use. So the escort online, brothel and brothel-like, street-based, and then we identified something called that we called a closed sex buyer network. And this was something that hadn't kind of been looked at very closely in Minnesota before our report, which is really about sex buyers themselves forming groups connected to traffickers as a way to avoid detection and really get exactly what it is that they're looking for. So because it's not public, because it operates through text and through face-to-face interactions, it's a lot harder to detect and surface from a law enforcement perspective. So from that study, mapping the market, we tried to look at sex buyers, but what we realized is that people who purchase sex from juveniles in Minneapolis are not necessarily from Minneapolis. They're actually from the whole Twin Cities, from across Minnesota, and in some cases from Canada, as Kate mentioned. So really to understand that part of the marketplace, we had to expand our study to look at the whole state of Minnesota. Before I dive in there, just a teeny bit about sex buyers, what we know about sex buyers from the academic literature. This is the most understudied area of the marketplace. So there's really been 2 types of research. There's been research looking at people who purchase sex in street-based prostitution or commercial sex, particularly studying people who've been referred to John schools. So that's one pretty substantial literature base, but it's not necessarily representative of the whole of the commercial sex market. The other, there's been a lot of work done on online, high-end groups of men who call themselves hobbyists, and there's been a lot of work done there because they think that what they're doing is fine, and so they're okay connecting with researchers to share their perspectives on why they're involved in the marketplace. In terms of prevalence, there hasn't been a whole lot of work done on the prevalence of sex buying behavior. We were able to find only one study, and that was a nationally representative sample of men in the United States, and they found that 14% of men said that they had purchased sex at some point in their life, with 1% of that group of men saying that they had purchased sex within the past year. So that's kind of the only thing that we were able to find that gave us some information about prevalence. So just a teeny bit about our methods for the sex buyer study that I'm going to very soon get to some results for you. So we used community-based and mixed methods approach, and really Following on our community-based approach of doing research at UROC, we wanted to really get a sense of the lay of the land in Minnesota from people who are knowledgeable, first-hand experts across the state. We did not interview people who purchase sex, and we did not interview victims and survivors, because at this point we didn't know enough, and we know that kind of research can actually be traumatizing. So before we did anything along those lines, we wanted to get a sense from across the state what people already know about the issue. So we interviewed 157 people. About half were law enforcement and about half were social service providers. And within that, we looked at people from small towns, from all across the state. So the other thing we did, we interviewed, we also looked at the Minnesota Court Information Systems. So that is the state court where prostitution cases are referred. We looked at all those cases of sex trafficking and prostitution just to see who has actually been arrested for prostitution in Minnesota. And then we also looked at print news media from 1995 through 2015, because we wanted to understand how is the media covering this issue. And what we found is that really the media isn't talking about sex buyers. Mostly they're talking about, in the early years, they're talking about, in very stigmatizing terms, people who are victims. In the later years, they're talking more about sex traffickers. Only about 24% of the articles that we reviewed actually talked about sex buyers. So again, this tells us this is a group of people that are not necessarily focused on or seen as part of the issue that we need to be addressing. So, another reason that we used these methods is because all sources of data have inherent weaknesses. So what we tried to do was get multiple different sources of data, pool them together in a way that we could kind of bounce one off the other, and then we can feel more confident about trends that we observe. Because this is a really difficult topic to do research on, because it is illegal and stigmatized, and there is no way to really do a representative sample, per se, of people who are involved in commercial sex. So that's a real limitation to any research on the topic. Okay, now I'm going to jump into some findings. I also just want to give a little bit of a warning. So I'm going to put a bunch of quotes. Some of those quotes have difficult material. Some of them have swearing. But we wanted to present the information in the format that it was told to us. But I just wanted to give people a warning. If people need to stand up or walk around or stretch your legs or take a break, I will not be in any way, shape, or form offended or worried if people need to step out. So if at any point that you feel like that would be helpful, I would really like you to take care of yourself. Okay, so if we go back to those questions, we were really looking at who, where, how, and what, right? So those are sort of the basic questions that were behind the research. So when we look at who, really in Minnesota, the majority of people who purchase sex are mostly white married men. Before we did this study, people had a lot of ideas about who might be purchasing sex, but from looking at sting operations and from talking with people who work directly with victims and survivors who have knowledge of what their experiences were, all across the data sources, it's very clear that it's predominantly white married men. And I will say police officers in Minnesota have a very unique knowledge base, because as part of how they do the sting operations is posting fake ads on Backpage. So they actually get a flood of contact. So they might make 10 arrests, but they've interacted with thousands of people over text. And they can see a great deal about what sex buyers are saying through text, how they're approaching the marketplace. how they're talking about people that they want to purchase sex from. So it's actually it's an incredibly unique source of knowledge, and so our ability to interview law enforcement from across the state really deepened what we were able to find. So the other thing about this, we saw a range in age from 18 to 70s. So there was no specific age category, although there was kind of a clustering of men who are a little bit further along in their careers and have a little bit more disposable income. And we found a wide range of occupations from CEOs of companies, truckers, farmers, police officers, judges, so kind of the whole gamut of careers, and also blue-collar workers as well. A little bit about where. So this is a particularly difficult topic to understand because there just isn't a lot of data. And in Minnesota, there was a sort of a strong assumption that commercial sex and this commercial sex market was an urban problem. So most people in rural Minnesota and in small towns really were saying, this doesn't impact us. But when we dug deeper into the data that we are able to find, what we found is that actually people purchase sex all over Minnesota, in small towns and large towns, and people travel. So people from rural Minnesota travel to the cities, but they also travel between small towns in order to purchase sex. So this little map here just shows where we were able to document that people have purchased sex, where people lived. So the darker shades are where sex buyers who are identified by law enforcement and the media, where they actually live. And I want to say this is just woefully inadequate because we identified 400 people. And if this nationally representative sample that suggests 14% of men have purchased sex at some point in their life, if that's true, there should be about 380,000 people in Minnesota who've purchased sex. And through this painstaking research project, we were able to identify 400, right? So it's just a teeny snapshot of who's actually purchasing sex in Minnesota. So travel is a really key part of what we found is a very key part of how sex buyers interact with the marketplace. So typically, people don't purchase sex in their hometown. So we saw a lot of flow from the suburbs to the inner city of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And particularly their travel was around work, so lunch hour, the commute in, and the commute out. So we saw that work day is really an anchor for a lot of sex buyers and how they, in a way, keep the anonymity and build it into their day in a way that won't be discovered by other people in their lives. We also saw people purchasing sex during business trips and vacations, so sort of an opportunistic use of travel as a way to, again, hide sex buying behavior. In rural Minnesota, we really saw that people traveled on average about 30 to 60 miles outside of their hometown to purchase sex. For obvious reasons, in a small town, if you're purchasing sex, you're more likely to be recognized by people in your town. We also saw people traveling to purchase sex because they were looking for something specific, what was called quote-unquote unusual, that they might not be able to find in their hometown. So sex buyers looking for something very specific would travel much longer distances in order to find the sexual experience that they were looking for. Whoops. Okay, so a little bit about how sex buyers enter the marketplace. We really found, again, this isn't necessarily new information, but part of what we were trying to do is sort of package it in a whole so we can understand how these things are linked together. So we identified three, can you guys even read those? They're kind of small up there. We identified three primary ways that people access the marketplace. So internet aided, which I think we've we've all heard a lot about with Backpage.com. But one thing I want to emphasize is that the direct online ads, where somebody posts an ad online and then somebody answers that ad, is only part of how sex buying happens through internet aided. So we saw a very strong trend toward social media, particularly for sex buyers who are looking for young people. Use of social media to cultivate connections, to identify potential people to victimize. And this was quite a predatory type of behavior that sex buyers were displaying in the social media arena. And then we also heard a little bit about the deep web or the dark web. That tends, at least in the US, and I don't know about here, but it tends to be more related to child pornography. But we did see some people were mentioning the use of the dark web, again, for very young people. So that's internet aided. We identified 37 sites that function like Backpage.com. Do you guys have Backpage.com here? I think you do. So, but that's just one of about 37 different sites that function in the same way. So the internet is a wide and vast terrain for people to purchase sex. The second mode that we identified is what we were calling direct solicitation. So in this mode, a sex buyer would directly approach a person. So this would be a traditional street-based setting, but we also saw lots of instances of sex buyers going to places where there might be youth or adults who are particularly vulnerable. So going to shelters, going to parks in areas that have high poverty rates, approaching young people who are pregnant or parenting. So again, there's a sort of a predatory aspect to that direct solicitation component. And then the other that I mentioned, we saw again word of mouth networks. And from a sex buyer perspective, this is a particularly important mode of entering the market because it's safer for them. They can elude detection, and sex buyers can then get exactly what it is that they're looking for. So if the marketplace is structured by sex buyer preferences and behavior, this closed sex buyer network is really a way of making the marketplace work for you as a sex buyer. And those closed sex buyer networks are typically connected with a trafficker. So that particular marketplace, the sex buyers are very knowledgeable about what it is that they're doing. So they're sort of in the know about how the marketplace works, if that makes sense. So another important finding, I think, is that for many sex buyers, the way the marketplace is structured obscures from their immediate view, it obscures trafficking. So if a sex buyer is approaching the marketplace through online or through direct solicitation, it's not always obvious whether or not the person they're interacting with is a trafficking victim or a young person. And I also want to say it's also not, from the police officers that we've talked to, it's not as if most sex buyers are really asking, so there's sort of blinders. But it is easier for them to not have to know about what's going on for that young person or that adult. And we do know that there are some people involved in commercial sex who are not trafficking victims. So for many sex buyers, when they approach the marketplace through interactions with people they believe to be independent providers, they're not going to necessarily see the trafficking or exploitation behind there. So we found that internet-aided and direct solicitation are areas where it can be murky for sex buyers to know whether or not the person is in fact a victim of trafficking. But as I mentioned, this is a complex and multifaceted marketplace. So there are definitely some sex buyers who clearly know that the person that they're purchasing sex from is trafficked. And there are some sex buyers who either willingly or are looking for juveniles or are willing to purchase sex from somebody who is under the age of 18. So in talking with police and others, we think most sex buyers are looking for somebody young, but they're not necessarily making a distinction between 18, 19, 16, right? So if in an undercover sting operation, the officer says, I don't have somebody who's an adult available, but we do have somebody who's juvenile, they thought about half of the people who answered that ad would be willing to purchase sex from a juvenile, but might not necessarily be looking to purchase sex from a juvenile. But there is a group of sex buyers who are looking for very young people, and we found that they're willing to travel greater distances and sort of form these sex buyer networks. So just a teeny bit about what sex buyers seek to purchase. On the whole, the most common thing we heard about was quick and anonymous sex as the primary thing that people are looking for. And we think sex buyers have a range in frequency, so sometimes they're purchasing sex on a very regular basis, calling themselves hobbyists, in the marketplace all the time, but then there are other sex buyers who are really situational or not purchasing sex on a regular basis. We also found that, a really broad range of kind of sexual acts and experiences that were requested, but the most common one is, again, this sort of quick anonymous sex with a stranger. We did see a lot of evidence that many sex buyers are seeking to purchase acts that are humiliating and that harm people, and that's something that they ask for up front. And these include derogatory language and racial slurs. We saw, it was a little unexpected for us, we saw a strong trend of sex buyers who are purchasing sex from youth, asking for urination and defecation to be part of the Commercial Sex Act. And we heard about this from across the state, actually, from people who work with youth as a particularly strong trend. We saw people asking for rough sex, for violence, for rape, obviously murder, while very rare, definitely does happen as part of this. I just want to say and note a lot of what we learned about that some sex buyers are seeking is illegal in a non-commercial sexual context, right? So assault and rape. But most victims are not able to seek justice for a variety of reasons. So in theory, they should be able to report these crimes, but obviously because they're involved in illegal activity and it's stigmatized, they typically don't report to the police. And we know in the past, when they have reported these instances to the police, police in Minnesota, in Minneapolis, were calling it a quote-unquote no pay, which means they weren't viewing it as a sexual assault, they were viewing it as a failure to pay for the service that was provided. So I think that mentality among the police officers has really shifted in the last 5 years, but still it's a huge barrier to going to the police. So I'm going to wrap up so we have some time for questions. And just make a couple of points about sort of some overarching themes that we identified in our study. So when we look at the sort of primary marketplace, so as I mentioned, the market has sort of a primary aspect and then lots of different segments. But when we look at the primary aspect, we really see that commercial sexual exploitation and the marketplace for sex seems to be an amplification of structural inequalities in our broader society. And it's built into the marketplace. So racism, sexism, and ageism in terms of how people's bodies get actually valued in the marketplace. A pricing hierarchy based on race and age So it's sort of baked into how the commercial sex market functions. And again, I just want to emphasize that the marketplace is multifaceted. So there's different experiences in different segments. When we're talking about or learning about transgender people involved in commercial sex, their experience is different. And the people purchasing, there's a bifurcation. There's extreme violence on the one hand for transgender people, but then there are also market segments where they feel in a way safer and more validated for their gender identity, right? So there's some complexities to how this works. And we see in Minnesota and elsewhere, there's just a huge overrepresentation of people of color and LGBTQ young people in the marketplace. So we need to think about that in terms of structural inequalities. And then when we add, if we take the kind of the supply side that we've been talking about, the victims of commercial sexual exploitation, and the demand side, when we put these two halves of the marketplace together, what we see is sort of mostly white men of means purchasing sex from primarily and predominantly young women of color and marginalized people. Right? So when we see the marketplace if we sort of pull the lens back, that's sort of the underpinning of what we're seeing. And so the relationship between the demand and the supply is really rooted in structural inequalities. And a difficult thing that came up as part of our work, in many ways this demand is filling basic needs of a lot of young people who are marginalized, who are not being well cared for by our social safety nets in the Twin Cities or by our community. So one thing that we heard from a number of people, if we end demand, what are young people going to do for a place to stay, for food, for really basic needs? So there's this kind of troubling paradox. Obviously, this is a harmful and exploitative situation for young people, but they are feeding themselves. They're feeding sometimes their children, sometimes their siblings, sometimes their whole families. And when we talk to young people, there's a strength and a resilience. They're surviving, and they're figuring out how to care for their families. So I just think it's easy for some people to talk about ending the demand, but we have to actually also think about how are we going to better support young people, particularly young people who are marginalized. But I want to emphasize that the marketplace is multifaceted, and there are people who have different experiences that are not as exploitative as what I was just talking about. So I'm just going to conclude now. And just to wrap up, so our goal in this study was really to surface some just basic empirical evidence about the marketplace from the perspective of sex buyers. It's clear that the marketplace is really complex, and I think just from some of the things that I've shared, there's a lot of multifaceted nuance around different market segments and how people are treated. But I think this overarching structural piece is absolutely critical for us to think about as we think about how do we reduce exploitation and harm. So there's a couple of important questions that our study did not ask that I get asked all the time and that I can't answer because we didn't bake it in, which is why. A lot of people want to know why are sex buyers involved in the marketplace and why are they doing the behaviors that they do. In order to answer that question, we really would have to interview people who purchase sex, and I think that could be a next step from this study. And part of the reason we didn't talk to people who purchase sex as part of this study is because before we understand the lay of the land, we don't know where to go to find people who are purchasing sex in a way that allows us to know, is this just some weird pocket of people over here? How do they relate to other segments, right? So this study that we're doing is an attempt to help us place different people in the marketplace who purchase sex. So when we do go to do interview sex buyers themselves, we can actually understand how representative are they of the larger marketplace. So that's one thing that that we did not do in this study. Really, we just wanted to create kind of a map, just to get a sense of what's happening. But I think our report raises some important questions about how should we be focusing on demand reduction? Do we try to do blanket demand reduction? Do we focus on specific areas for demand reduction? Where do we start? In Minnesota, there's been a lot of work around demand reduction, around raising awareness. And I think we need to grapple with some of these really difficult structural reasons why young people and adults are exploited in commercial sex. If we want to end sex trafficking, in many ways, this is a racial equity issue. It's a gender equity issue, right? We have to think of some of those larger pieces as we think about sex trading and trafficking. So with that, I think I'll conclude and see if anybody has any questions.
Are there any, if you have any questions, please pass them down to the end of the table, and we'll. Can you please speak to the vulnerability and exploitation of newcomers, refugees, and ethnocultural communities?
Sure. So, yeah, most of what I've been talking about is what in the U.S. we call domestic human trafficking. So it's people who are from the United States, grew up there, but there are unique situations that happen for international victims of human trafficking in terms of how the trafficking situation happens with control of documents, with different reasons. So thinking about migration and human trafficking, there's a lot of complicated things about border crossing and things like that. In terms of sex buyers, what we found is actually, we didn't learn a ton about international victims. It tends to fall more into a labor trafficking frame in Minnesota. And the cases that we did see were primarily brothel and massage parlor based. So sex buyers who are specifically looking for, particularly people from Asia, would go to massage parlors or brothels in Minnesota. But there's different people who investigate those situations. That's mostly, if there's foreign travel and if there's travel across the state, we would have the Federal Bureau of Investigation that would be investigating those cases. In some instances, local police would, but I think quickly it would bump up to the federal level. So we interviewed some federal officers, but mostly we were looking at local law enforcement for our interviews. I don't know if I answered that question appropriately, but.
I'm just going to add in a little bit. My husband's a researcher, data guy, and he was commenting this morning that actually Canada is a more ethnically, racially, culturally diverse country now than the U.S., partly because of our different approaches to immigration. And so I think this is going to be our Canadian contribution. This is the work that we need to do.
Yes. Right now, given our political climate in the U.S., let's put that out there, oftentimes issues around human trafficking get framed not as exploitation, but as illegal immigration, which is not how those of us who do the work on the ground view it. But like we even had a governor, a Republican governor, who was saying things like, why would Minnesota be concerned with sex trafficking? That's an immigration issue. We shouldn't even be thinking about it in that frame. So to your point, the U.S. right now in particular is quite a hostile environment for foreign nationals. And I assume you guys get the news about all the absolute craziness. I'm just going to go on record saying that I think it's at any rate. Thank you. So yeah, all the border wall stuff. It just all gets framed in a really kind of weird way that just doesn't quite make sense. But I think our law enforcement on the ground, and we work with some. The other tricky thing is, so our Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or ICE, they handle illegal immigration, and they are also charged with handling some of the sex trafficking cases. So it's if you're a victim of sex trafficking or human trafficking, really, and a foreign national, the people who are supposed to be helping you are also the people who could deport your family. So it's this very complicated mix, even though we have a T visa, which is supposed to be for trafficking victims. If they are willing to go to court and testify, they can have residence through this T visa. But T visas are very rarely used in the U.S. because of this climate around immigration. We're just not a very welcoming place right now. Federally and from this sort of official standpoint, I think if you go to communities in Minnesota, we actually are far more welcoming than our federal government and our rhetoric might suggest.
Thank you. Do you have a sense of what proportion of providers/victims are not experiencing exploitation? For example, providers who control their own transactions, income, and self-determination.
So that's also a very difficult question that comes down to inability to do a representative sample of people involved in commercial sex. So I can't actually answer that question. I wish I could. But what I can say is we know that the people who are in that provider-victim role, there is a continuum. And we know that, like we have a group now in Minneapolis called the Sex Worker Outreach Project, SWAP. And I don't know if you have SWAP chapters. Sex Worker Outreach Project. It's in the U.S. for sure. It's across the state and it's across the country, and it's part of the sex worker rights movement. And each chapter is its own local kind of coalition of organizers. And you know, they present a very different picture of how and why they're involved in commercial sex. And as a researcher, it's not my role to tell people what their experiences are or to tell them that they're being victimized if they're not. It's my role as a researcher to connect with people and listen to their perspectives and their experiences. So I know this group is there, and most of my work has been with people more involved in or exploited through commercial sexual exploitation or sex trafficking. So that tends to be where my work has centered. So all I can say, long way of saying, we know there's many experiences in commercial sex. I don't know the proportion, and depending on who you talk to, some people might say, people make claims about that, but to my knowledge, there is no research that actually definitively tells us the answer to that question. So I'm always dubious when people make claims about proportion.
Well, we have about 1 minute left, so I'm actually, we don't have time for the next 4 questions, but I'm going to read them out because, again, the whole purpose of inviting Lauren Martin was to stimulate, was to learn and then to stimulate conversation in our own city. So there's two clusters of questions, one around research related to indoor massage parlors or brothels. And I think that's certainly something that is on our agenda as a city and community. Another was, how are you educating the demand side, like using media, billboards, public education? And a parallel question to that, which I think is really interesting for Alberta, Minnesota, is, has there been any mapping done specifically around the pipeline? Because that's another big issue between our two countries. So we don't have time for those, but maybe in our conversation over the next couple of days, we'll get a couple of answers, and we may post some responses on the Edmonton SUG website. Just to let you know, after lunch today, Dr. Martin is going to be meeting with our Protection of Sexually Exploited Children Act team. So that is provincial, regional, law enforcement, addictions and mental health, and all the people working as part of that PSECA team. Tomorrow morning, she's going to be having a knowledge exchange conversation, looking again at the racialization and sexualization in the commercial sex market. And then after that, there's going to be a small meeting with researchers in our community. And so we are very thankful that you carved out this time to come up to Edmonton and help keep the conversation going here. Thank you.
Thank you very much.